Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
first of all, to compliment Senator McCaskill and Senator Johnson for their leadership of bringing this bill out of their committee, a committee I don't serve on, but a bill that's very important to the oversight work of this senator, and I hope every senator considers it very important. And I would say that I agree with everything they have said. I want to emphasize what they said, and I want to take a few minutes to do that because I feel strongly about this piece of legislation. But there's an important principle here, a very important principle that we ought to keep in mind because it's an insult to 100 senators and 435 members of the House of Representatives. When legislation's written and you explain very clearly what that legislation is supposed to accomplish, that an inspector general would have access to all records, and then you have a lawyer in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, one person making an interpretation of a law that's contrary to congressional intent, but that one person out of 2 million people in the executive branch of government that can override the will of 535 members of Congress. And that will was expressed way back in 1978. And just a little different quote of a letter that Senator Johnson's already talked about from a respected member of this Senate for 24 or maybe 30 years, Senator John Glenn of Ohio, who was very much interested in making sure that we had strong oversight by Congress and within the executive branch, that they had strong oversight that the IG would do within a specific department. And he was one of the chief architects, Senator John Glenn of Ohio, one of the chief architects of this legislation. He quotes, full and unfettered access is vital to an IG's ability to effectively prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse in an agency's programs and activities, end of quote. Now here we are, what Senator John Glenn said when he was a member of this body and this legislation passed. And we have one lawyer out of 2 million executive branch employees interpreting a statute contrary to congressional intent and then overriding. In other words, giving cabinet heads opportunities to avoid doing what the Inspector General law says and what an Inspector General needs to do their job, have access to all records. Senator McCaskill made that clear. Senator Johnson made that clear. This is a bipartisan effort coming unanimously out of this committee, that this is such an egregious attack on the powers of Congress that we can't let one person out of 2 million people in the executive branch of the government get away with. And yet, we seem to have some problems getting it passed. I don't understand it. You try to explain that to the people of this country, whether it's in New York City or whether it's in Des Moines, Iowa. There's no way that this can be justified, that one lawyer out of 2 million people in the executive branch of government can issue an opinion and override the Congress of the United States. So I intend to go into some detail about how I feel about this legislation, if you haven't come to that conclusion already. To ensure accountability and transparency in government, Congress created inspectors generals, or IGs, as our eyes and ears within the executive branch. That's the foresight of a famous senator and astronaut by the name of John Glenn. But IGs cannot do their job without timely and independent access to all agency records. That's why this bill is called All Means All. Agencies cannot be trusted to restrict the flow of potentially embarrassing documents to the IGs who oversee them. If the agencies can keep IGs in the dark, then this Congress will be kept in the dark as well. So, when Congress passed the Inspector General's Act in 1978, the Congress explicitly said that IGs should have access to all agency records. Inspectors General are designed to be independent, but to also be part of an agency. Inspectors General, are there to help agency leadership identify and correct waste, fraud, and abuse. What cabinet head wouldn't want somebody in their department to have access to all records that shows that maybe that department isn't spending money according to congressional intent, or maybe not following the law the way Congress intended? It ought to be welcomed by any administration head. Fights between an agency and its own Inspector General over access to documents are a waste of taxpayers' money and the personnel's time. The law requires that Inspector Generals have access to all agency records, precisely, by the way, to avoid these costly and time-consuming disputes. However, since 2010, a handful of agencies, led by the FBI, and I respect the FBI, but in this case I don't, has refused to comply with this legal obligation. The Justice Department claimed that the Inspector General could not access certain records until, guess what? Department leadership gave them permission to do it, even though the law says they're entitled to all documents. Requiring private approval from agency leadership for access to agency information undermines Inspectors General independence. That's bad enough, but it also causes wasteful delays. After this access problem came to light, Congress took action. So we have the 2015 Department of Justice Appropriation Act declaring, this is a Congress again declaring, that no funds should be used to deny the Inspector General timely access to all records. In other words, just this year, or last year when the appropriation bill was passed for 2015, we had members of Congress saying that this lawyer, out of 2 million executive branch employees, that's frustrating the will of Congress, was wrong. This new law also directed the Inspector General to report to Congress within 5 days whenever there was a failure to comply with this requirement. In February alone, the Justice Department's IG notified Congress of 3 separate occasions in which the FBI failed to provide access to records requested for oversight investigations. IGs for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Commerce, and the Peace Corps have experienced similar stonewalling. Then in July, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, that's this one lawyer out of 2 million employees, the Office of Legal Counsel released a memo arguing that we did not really mean all records when we put those words in the statute. Now here you got somebody in the Justice Department, one person out of 2 million employees, trying to tell 535 members of Congress what they meant when they said all means all. So let me be clear. We meant what we said in the IG Act. All records really means all records. Now, I told you about the Department of Justice Appropriation Act. responding to this a year ago. Well, 1 week after this report was issued, that the Office of Legal Counsel issued its awful legal opinion, Senator Mikulski and Shelby, all outstanding members of the Appropriations Committee, sent a letter to the Justice Department correcting the Office of Legal Counsel's misreading of the appropriations rider, also known as Section 218. And I'd like to read from Mikulski and Shelby letter. Quote, "We write to inform you that the OLC's interpretation of Section 218 is wrong, and the subsequent conclusion of our committee's intention is wrong. We expect the department and all of its agencies to fully comply with Section 218 and to provide the Office of Inspector General with full and immediate access to all records, documents, and other materials in accordance with Section 6A of the Inspector General's Act." Now, so you write a statute in 1978, no problems with it, until this person, one lawyer out of 2 million executive branch employees, writes an opinion saying all doesn't mean all. And then you have members of the body that are insulted by that interpretation, and these members write, "No money in this appropriation bill can be used to carry out that Office of Legal Counsel opinion." And if they would be listening to the members of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Johnson and Senator McCaskill would not have to work so hard to correct a bad opinion, contrary to congressional intent, that was written by the Office of Legal Counsel. So I want to applaud my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, particularly Senators Mikulski and Shelby, for standing up for the Inspectors General. In early August, I chaired a Judiciary Committee hearing on the Office of Legal Counsel opinion and the devastating impact it is already having on the work of Inspectors General across the government. Now, remember, the Office of Legal Counsel is in the Justice Department. Well, we had a Justice Department witness before our committee, disagreed with the results of the Office of Legal Counsel opinion, and actually supported legislative action to solve the problem. So, following the hearing, 11 of my colleagues and I sent a bipartisan, I want to emphasize bipartisan, as well as bicameral letter to the Department of Justice and the Inspector General community. In this letter, the chair and ranking members of the Committee of Jurisdiction in both the House and Senate asked for specific legislative language to reaffirm that all means all, as the witness from the Justice Department said that there ought to be legislative language to correct this awful interpretation by one lawyer out of 2 million employees in the executive branch, overriding 535 members of Congress. It took the Justice Department 3 months to respond to this letter, and its proposed language was far too narrow to actually override this Office of Legal Counsel opinion. However, we had the Inspector General community responded to our letter within 2 weeks. In September, a bipartisan group of senators and I incorporated the core of this language into the bill that we're talking about today, S-579. It's entitled the Inspector General Empowerment Act of 2015. In total, 13 colleagues have joined me on this bill, including Senators Johnson, McCaskill, Ernst, Baldwin, Carper, Cornyn, Langford, Collins, Ayotte, Kirk, Mikulski, Fisher, and Wyden. Bipartisan. I'm grateful to each of them for standing up with me for inspectors general. I especially want to thank Senator Johnson and McCaskill, as I've already done, but do it again, for working closely with me on this legislation from the very beginning and for their work in getting this bill through their committee. Now let me tell you what this bill does. The Inspector General Empowerment Act includes further clarification that Congress intended IGs to have access to all agency records, notwithstanding any other provision of law, unless other laws specifically state that IGs are not to receive such access. Let me be clear. The purpose of this provision is to nullify and overturn this awful decision that this one lawyer in the Department of Justice, out of 2 million plus federal employees in the executive branch, issued this opinion. These words, notwithstanding any other provision of law, language, is key to accomplishing that goal. But the bill does much more than overturning the OLC opinion, which has been roundly criticized by both sides of the aisle. It bolsters IG independence by preventing agency heads from placing them on arbitrary and indefinite administrative leave. It promotes transparency by requiring IGs to post more than reports of their reports online, including those involving misconduct by senior officials that the Justice Department chose not to prosecute. Also, the bill equips IGs with tools they need to conduct effective investigations, such as the ability to subpoena testimony from former federal employees. When employees of the U.S. government are accused of wrongdoing or misconduct, IGs should be able to conduct a full and thorough investigation of those allegations. Getting to the bottom of these allegations is necessary to restore public trust, and God only knows how much restoration of public trust in the government in Washington we have to restore. Unfortunately, employees who may have violated that trust are often allowed to evade the IG's inquiry by simply retiring from the government. So, the bill empowers IGs to obtain testimony from employees like that. Similarly, the bill helps IGs better expose waste, fraud, and abuse by those who receive federal funds. It enables IGs to require testimony from government contractors and subcontractors and grantees and subgrantees. Currently, most IGs can subpoena documents from entities from outside their agency. However, most cannot subpoena testimony, just documents, although there are a few agencies that can, and for example, the Inspector General for the Defense Department and the Department of Health and Human Services already have that authority. The ability to require witnesses outside the agency to talk to the IG can be critical in carrying out an Inspector General's statutory duties or recovering wasted federal funds. The IG community recently provided me with numerous examples of actual, real-life cases that illustrate the need to subpoena witnesses. And so I would ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a document that lists these examples.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter that I received yesterday from the Project on Government Oversight for the record.
Without objection.
The Project on Government Oversight is a nonpartisan, independent watchdog that has been advocating good government reforms for decades. And in this letter, the Project on Government Oversight expresses its support for this bill in general and for the provisions that equip the Inspectors General with the authority to require testimony. But, Madam President, I want it to be clear. The bill also imposes limitations on the authority of IGs to require testimony. There are several procedural protections in place to ensure that this authority is exercised wisely. For example, the subpoena must first be approved by a majority of a designated panel of 3 other IGs. It is then referred to the Attorney General. For those IGs that can already subpoena witnesses' testimony, I am not aware of any instance in which it has been misused. In fact, the Inspector General for the Department of Defense has established a policy that spells out additional procedures and safeguards to ensure that subjects of subpoenas are treated fairly. I'm confident that the rest of the IG community will be just as scrupulous in providing appropriate protection for the use of this authority. You see, we all win when inspectors general can do their jobs. And most importantly, the public is better served when IGs are able to shine light into government operations and stewardships of the taxpayers' dollars. In September, we attempted to pass this important bill by unanimous consent. It has been nearly 3 months since leadership asked whether any senator would object. Not one senator has put a statement in the record or come to the floor to object publicly. At the August Judiciary Committee hearing, there was a clear consensus that Congress needed to act legislatively and needed to overturn this Office of Legal Counsel opinion that one person out of 2+ million employees in the executive branch that overruled this 1978 act, that Inspector General ought to be entitled to all information. And every day that goes by without fixing the Office of Legal Counsel opinion is another day that watchdogs across government can be stonewalled. At that hearing, Senator Leahy said that this access problem is, quote, blocking what was once a free flow of information, end of quote, and Senator Leahy called for a permanent legislative solution. Senator Cornyn noted that the Office of Legal Counsel opinion is, quote, ignoring the mandate of Congress, end of quote, and undermining the oversight authority that Congress has under the Constitution. And Senator Tillis stated that the need to fix this access problem was, quote, a blinding flash of the obvious, and that we all seem to be in violent agreement that we need to correct this, end of quote. However, now, some members raise concern about guaranteeing IGs unchecked access to certain national security information. Fortunately, we were able to agree on some changes to the bill that address those concerns without gutting the core of the bill. We made these concessions so that the bill can pass by unanimous consent. And I thank my colleagues who worked with me to arrive at this compromise. We thank them. But as we move forward, it is important to note the following. First, I am not aware of a single instance in which an IG has mishandled any classified or sensitive information. IGs are subject to the same restrictions on disclosing information as everyone else in the agency that they oversee. Second, the executive orders restricting and controlling classified information are issued under the President's constitutional authority. So, naturally, this bill does not attempt to limit that constitutional authority at all. It just clarifies that no law can prevent an IG from obtaining documents from the agency it oversees unless the statute explicitly states that IG access should be restricted. No one thinks that this statute could supersede the President's constitutional authority. And third, there is already a provision in the law that allows the Secretary of Defense to prohibit an Inspector General review to protect vital national security interests and to protect sensitive operational information. We agreed to clarify that already existing provision to include the ability to restrict access to information as well as to prevent a review from occurring. However, we kept the language in that provision that requires notification to Congress whenever that authority to restrict an IG's access to information is exercised. After making these changes, we attempted to hotline the revised bill last week. Since then, no senator has publicly stated any other concerns. The co-sponsors have worked hard behind the scenes over the past 3 months in good faith to accommodate the concerns of any and all members willing to work with us. Now the time has come to pass this bill. We all lose when inspectors general are delayed or prevented in doing the work. So I urge my colleagues to stand up for inspectors general, overturn the Office of Legal Counsel opinion, and restore the intent of the Inspector General's Act. All IGs should have access and timely independent access to all agency records. But the most important thing here is the principle that that any one lawyer in the Department of Justice or any agency of government doesn't have a right to override the opinion of the Congress expressed in statute so clearly as this is expressed. So, Madam President, at this time, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 68, S579, the Inspector General Empowerment Act of 2015. I further ask that the Johnson substitute amendment be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection? Objection is heard.
Would the senator yield to a question?
The senator from Iowa has the floor.
Madam President, would the senator yield for a question?
Yes.
May I ask on whose behalf the minority leader is objecting? Is it on his own behalf or the behalf of another senator?
Other senators are concerned about it. I've made the objection on my behalf.
Yeah, it seems to me that I'm not going to question what you just said, but it seems to me that if we ought to know who that senator is besides you, because Senator Wyden and I have worked very hard over the last 10 years, and we finally got done what we thought was a very good measure for this body, that people put holes on legislation, they ought to be made public, and there has nothing been in the record. So why don't these people have guts enough to put in the record their reasons and who they are? The public has a right to know that.
I'm it.
Madam President.
No.
Madam President.